Good day. Our group will be presenting the Enlightenment period. We hope that at the end of our presentation, we would all be able to have a good understanding and a glimpse of what it was like during the said era. The period known as the Enlightenment runs from somewhere around 1660 with the restoration or the crowning of the exiled Charles II until the beginning of the 19th century and the reign of Queen Victoria. For much of the 18th century, a new way of thinking became increasingly common in both Western Europe and the American colonies of North America. Known as both the Age of Reason and Enlightenment, this period was very different than earlier epochs of European history. So, this was, or during this time, this period was an awakening for the thinkers of Europe, uh, Western Europe in particular, which extended to their colonies in the Americas. So this was an interesting time, um, an interesting time because a lot of people began to question a lot of things. While the Enlightenment period was tremendously broad in terms of its movement, there are several core themes that were characteristics of it. There are three. So we will be looking at the major themes of the Enlightenment, which are reason, individualism, and skepticism. Let's start off with the first major theme of the period. So we have here reason or reasoning during the time. So Enlightenment thinkers typically denounce supernatural occurrences as mere superstition. Here is where it gets a little tricky though. You might think all Enlightenment thinkers were atheists, but they were not. This was not the case. In fact, most were not. To a degree, the Enlightenment spurred atheism, but more commonly, it resulted in a mix between Christianity and scientific rationalism. This is best illustrated by the Deist movement that gripped Europe and the United States during the late 18th century. The Deist movement or Deism is also known as the religion of nature. So, this refers to rational thinking or a rational theology that mainly believed that religious truth should be subject to human reasoning rather than divine intervention. So we have to remember that prior to the Enlightenment or the period before the Enlightenment, everything was belief. The belief in a supreme being was overwhelmingly powerful during those earlier times. Um, Whereas during the Enlightenment, people began to question a lot of things and they focus more on reasoning rather than mainly divine intervention. Let's move on to the individual during the Enlightenment period. So, an individual is believed to be endowed with certain liberties and rights. These rights were believed to have been granted by God and or by nature. Enlightenment figures typically espouse ideas of equality and human dignity. So, thinking or the individual or this theme or this way of thinking is very, very similar to what we have in the modern times. It's very interesting because prior to the Enlightenment period, everything revolved around belief in God. So there wasn't really no equality prior to the Enlightenment period, especially because they have had or there were classes in society. But during the Enlightenment period, this was greatly questioned because people or thinkers of the time believed that everyone uh, have their own rights and liberties. Let's move on to the third major theme of the period. We have here skepticism. So, to illustrate this point, let's look at something called the divine rights of kings. According to this view, which had been popular among Catholics for centuries, monarchs had been placed in positions of power by the will of God and were not subject to earthly powers. Basically, this was a fancy way of saying the king was above the law, but with the age of enlightenment, this idea began to lose its credibility. Enlightenment thinkers were skeptics. They typically rejected blind faith and they wanted proof in the modern sense. So, this is very interesting because this is very, very similar to the way we think nowadays. We go ahead and challenge a lot of things. So, for thinkers during the Enlightenment period, they did the same. So it's very interesting because during those times, uh, the monarchs, the kings and the queens, are always above the law. But of course, nowadays that is not so. So it's very, it's again, it is a time of awakening for most people, especially the thinkers, because they just do not go ahead and believe what they are told. They question a lot of things and they focus or they always err on the side of reasoning that rather than just believing what they are being told or being fed with. So, moving on, of course, at the start of every new era, we have here important figures, major figures that were precursors, or people who started or who are famously known to be of importance during an era. So the early Enlightenment was or have had their precursors in famous figures such as the Englishman Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes, the Frenchman René Descartes, and key natural philosophers of the scientific revolution, which included Galileo Galilei, Johannes Kepler, and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. The early Enlightenment was from 1685 to 1730. So its roots are usually traced to 1680s England, where in the span of 3 years, Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica and John Locke his essay concerning human understanding. These two works provided the scientific, mathematical, and philosophical toolkit for the Enlightenment's major advancements or advances. So, in the next slides, we will be looking at some famous um, writers, prolific writers during the Enlightenment period. First off, we have here Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract, 1762. Rousseau was born in Geneva, Switzerland, and moved to Paris as a young man to pursue a career as a musician. Instead, he became famous as one of the greatest and most revolutionary thinkers to have ever lived. In the age of the absolute powers of kings, Rousseau argued against the monarchy's divine right to rule. He proclaimed the absurdity of submitting to coercion or slavery, stating that true political authority lies with the people. He also upset the other great power of the age, the church, by arguing that all religions are equal, and in their ability to instill goodness in people. The philosopher also belonged to the Romanticism literary movement, of which he is thought of to be one of its pioneers. Another famous figure of the time was Voltaire. His famous work was, I'm not really sure how to pronounce this, Candide, 1959. Voltaire was born Francois Marie Arouet, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, holds a special place in the world's collective memory as the symbol of the Enlightenment. An extremely prolific writer, Voltaire achieved fame for his polemic satires and acerbic wit. Although he originally wanted to become a tragedian, he publicly argued for freedom of religion and expression, the separation of church and state, and wrote formidable attacks on the Catholic Church and powerful French establishments. Voltaire has been feverishly quoted after the dreadful attacks in Paris on the 7th of January and the 15th of November in 2015, as his name instantly evokes the battle against religious fanaticism as well as the love of tolerance and freedom of thinking. So, probably nowadays he would be considered an activist for human rights and human freedom. So, he is well worth emulating. The next famous writer of the time was Diderot, famously known for Encyclopedia 1751. One word cannot capture Denis Diderot, who has more than one string to his bow. He was a writer, a philosopher, encyclopedist, literary and art critic, and translator, to only name a few. He marked history with one of his most impressive works of the time, the famous Encyclopedia, which he co wrote. The goal of the encyclopedia was, according to Diderot, to change the common way of thinking through the dissemination of knowledge and represent a revolution of scientific, secular, and open minded thought, thus undermining the authority of the two great powers during those times, the French monarchy and the Catholic Church. Not surprisingly, an entire Parisian university was named after him. Another famous writer of the time was a Frenchman, the Marquis de Sade, famously known for the 120 Days of Sodom. Donatien Alpon Francois, Marquis de Sade was, as you may guess, a nobleman who spent three-fourths of his life in prison and 10 years in the Bastille. The Bastille was famously known as a fortress or a prison in Paris, in France, where he was able to compose most of his sulfurous masterpiece, The 120 Days of Sodom, full of eroticism, violence, and extreme cruelty. Although his book was banned for centuries, Sade remained an icon of sexual libertinism, with the term sadism invented in his name at the end of the 19th century. The most popular work that came out of the Enlightenment period was, of course, the publication of the encyclopedia. The encyclopedia was published between 1751 and 1772 in 35 volumes, and it was compiled by Denis Diderot, Jean Leron d'Alembert, and a team of 150 other intellectuals. The encyclopedia has helped in spreading the ideas of the Enlightenment across Europe and beyond. We cannot deny the fact that in the past few years, before that internet was made available to everyone, the encyclopedia was of great importance in terms of knowledge, searching for new knowledge. The encyclopedia is a very powerful book of knowledge. Um, it is a tool in acquiring and improving the knowledge that you already have. So, moving on, we have here religion during the Enlightenment period. So, a number of novel ideas about religion developed with the Enlightenment, which included deism and talks of atheism. According to Thomas Paine, deism is the simple belief in God the Creator with no reference to the Bible or any other miraculous source. Instead, the deist relies solely on personal reason to guide his creed, which was eminently agreeable to many thinkers of the time. Atheism was much more discussed, but have had very few proponents. Wilson and Rail note, in fact, very few enlightened intellectuals, even when they were vocal critics of Christianity, were true atheists. Rather, they were critics of orthodox beliefs, wedded rather to skepticism, deism, vitalism, or perhaps pantheism. Some followed Pierre Bayle and argued that atheists could indeed be moral men. Many others, like Voltaire, held that without belief in a God who punishes evil, the moral order of society was undermined. That is, since atheists gave themselves to no supreme authority and no law, and had no fear of eternal consequences, they were far more likely to disrupt society. Bale observed that in his day, prudent persons will always maintain an appearance of religion, and he believed that even atheists could hold concepts of honor and go beyond their own self interest to create and interact in society. Locke said that if there were no God and no divine law, the result would be moral anarchy. Every individual could have no law but his own will, no end but himself. He would be a god to himself, and the satisfaction of his own will the soul will be the sole measure and end of all his actions. Now let's look at the ideas, several ideas that have dominated the Enlightenment thought. So we have here four. We have here rationalism, empiricism, progressivism, and cosmopolitanism. So, rationalism, this is the idea that humans are capable of using their faculty of reason to gain knowledge. Reason, rational, being rational. This was a sharp turn away from the prevailing idea that people needed to rely on scripture or church authorities for knowledge. Empiricism. This promoted the idea that knowledge comes from the experience and observation of the world. Progressivism. This is the belief that through the power of reason and observation, humans can make limited linear progress over time, and this belief was especially important as a response to the carnage and upheaval of the English civil wars in the 17th century. Last but not least, we have here cosmopolitanism. This reflected the Enlightenment thinkers' view of themselves as actively engaged citizens of the world, as opposed to provincial and close minded individuals. In all, Enlightenment thinkers endeavored to be ruled by reason and not prejudice. Our presentation may not justify um, the broadness of the events and the prominent people that made up the Enlightenment period. But we hope that with the few key characters mentioned during the presentation, you have learned something, or you were able to have an idea of the Enlightenment period. Thank you so much for your time and have a good day.